Why did the first cell arise? To first tackle this question, we need to know what exactly a cell is. Google says it's the smallest structural and functional unit of an organism, which is quite a vague definition. According to this definition, this means that cells make up organisms, like myself. But what are they exactly? If we use a microscope and zoom in on a cell, its general structure is revealed. First off, the cell has this outer boundary, which scientists call the cell surface membrane. Think of it like the boundary that encloses a cricket pitch. As it surrounds the cell, it's going to determine what enters and exits the cell. What else does the cell have? It also has this inner bit, which scientists call the cytoplasm. Think of it like a thick jelly that holds everything in place. It's also where a lot of key chemical reactions occur, but let's not get into that. Our cell also has this stuff floating around. This is the genetic material of the cell. It determines what the cell itself does and what goes on inside of it. This genetic material can be in the form of RNA, which is a single strand of nucleotide bases joined together, or DNA, which is a double strand of nucleotide bases joined together. All you need to remember is that these biological molecules have bases in a particular sequence, signifying particular information. One base sequence could code for a blue protein, whilst a different base sequence may code for a red protein. Let's picture what the conditions were like when the first cell arose, as these were likely to affect how and why it formed. Well, according to an NCBI article, the first cell arose around 3.8 billion years ago. That was back when the land was full of volcanic activity, and the atmosphere was full of gases in different proportions to the ones that we have today. For example, there was no oxygen back then, so us humans wouldn't have been able to breathe, and we wouldn't have been able to survive if we were around then. But we were obviously not. Anatomically modern humans only appeared 300,000 to 800,000 years ago, much later when oxygen was abundant in large quantities. Anyway, the conditions that I described on primitive Earth seem relatively hostile for delicate life to form. A scientist by the name of Stanley Miller was also perplexed by this, and he tried to find answers by mimicking these conditions, creating his own primitive Earth in a flask. He basically fed a gaseous mixture close to the one matching the atmosphere on primitive Earth into a flask. He filled the bottom of the flask with water, which was slightly heated, the reason being that oceans on primitive Earth were slightly hotter than they are today, because of the harsher sun rays. He also felt that he needed to add another factor. That factor was lightning, and he mimicked it using two metal electrodes, which sparked regularly. He returned to the apparatus a few days later and found that the water had turned yellow, with a black deposit residing at the bottom of the vessel. He analysed what this black deposit was, and found it to be amino acids. Why is this significant though? Amino acids are the fundamental components of proteins. Proteins are one of the building blocks of life. They are found in nearly all structures in living cells. Without proteins, cells would not be able to exist. With this massive discovery, many other scientists were inspired. From similar experiments, sugars were found to be made, which are substances that cells require for energy. One experiment found that the nucleotide base adenine could be made from solutions present on primitive Earth. Adenine is one of the bases that makes up DNA and RNA, which I explained earlier. Although all of these experiments showed that the conditions of primitive Earth allowed for the formation of these simple biological molecules, they still couldn't explain how larger molecules such as proteins and RNA could have formed. They couldn't show how amino acids joined together to form proteins and how nucleotide bases joined to form DNA or RNA. Also, it would have made it even more problematic as sun rays and lightning would have broken down molecules into smaller ones, not combined them to form larger ones. It happens though that this problem was overcome. It was found that rocks, due to their minerals, provided an attractive surface for the assembly of larger molecules. Clays specifically proved to have the ability to absorb amino acids onto their surface and allow amino acids to join together to form proteins. Some minerals were found to allow the formation of longer and more complex protein structures, whilst others were found to allow the formation of RNA. But how did DNA form? Well, we still don't have the answer to this question, but we could suggest how it came to be later in this video. Now, with RNA, we have genetic material, and we also have proteins, sugars, and water that will make up a lot of the cell, including the cytoplasm. Let's focus on how the cell surface membrane, how is it that this organelle came to be? Well, if we analyze the cell surface membrane of our cells, we can see that they are made up of a phospholipid bilayer. A phospholipid has the basic structure of a phosphate group attached to a glycerol molecule along with two other fatty acid molecules. Why is this relevant though? Well, the phosphate group is attracted to water, whilst the fatty acid tails repel water. So one side of the molecule is attracted to water and the other repels water. When you throw phospholipids into water, they form these vesicle structures filled with water, having a phospholipid bilayer. I keep saying bilayer because the vesicle is enclosed by two layers of phospholipids pointing in opposite directions. Notice how the phosphate groups are pointing out towards the water, whilst the fatty acid tails point inwards away from water. What does this vesicle almost look like though? Yes, a cell, but without all of the contents inside. Well, experiments further proved that these vesicles took up proteins and RNA. This is getting even closer to a cell. Okay, but where would phospholipids have come from? They are way too complex just to be lying there on primitive Earth by themselves. Well, they would have been derived from regular lipids, which could have come from various chemical reactions. There is little research in this area though, and we're bound to travel on a tangent if I am to answer it. Our vesicle with RNA and proteins is however not a cell yet, as it does not necessarily behave like a cell. It could just be floating around and doing nothing. It's all very well to have the right components assembled together, but it needs to function as a cell. What do I mean by this? It needs to be able to grow and make more of itself. Imagine if you damage your bicep muscle. Cells are going to die and they need to be replaced. To do this, cells grow and divide, making more of themselves to replace the damaged ones. For cells to grow and divide, it's all dependent on what is inside the cell though, the type of RNA and the type of proteins. If I didn't mention before, RNA can have different base sequences, and proteins can have different amino acid sequences. This influences their behavior. What instead if we just had RNA? RNA that was able to make itself. A self-replicating molecule that can produce more of itself so that there would be enough for new cells to be made. Scientists in the 1980s were confident in this approach as they had recently discovered ribozymes. These were molecules that were composed of RNA and helped produce RNA, although these structures weren't found in current cells. Similar structures were found to carry out similar roles. Nucleotides could have been joined randomly on rocks to form a piece of RNA that could have been enveloped by a phospholipid membrane, making the first cell. The cell could have then divided, making more of itself by joining with other vesicles, increasing in size, then dividing subsequently into smaller vesicles, each containing RNA. I make out this process to be simple and to have occurred perfectly, but this is unlikely to be the case. There would obviously be a very low chance that all of these events occurred together and have been so well coordinated. The fact that such an RNA molecule has such a specific sequence, the fact that this piece of RNA was encased in a phospholipid. You may still remain unconvinced as the chances of this event occurring are very low, but imagine the number of chances this opportunity arose. There would have been loads of places on Earth with optimum conditions, and there would have been billions of years for this to occur. Think of it like entering the lottery, and you were able to buy loads of tickets every week for billions of years. You would eventually win it, right? Although most of the time you would not win, and these scenarios would represent RNA that didn't self-replicate, or self-replicating RNA that wasn't taken into vesicles, or even cells that couldn't withstand the harsh sun rays or cycles of wetting and drying on rocks. This abides by Darwinian evolution. Some organisms, or cells in this case, have a high chance of survival and pass on their genetic information to the next generation. Darwinian evolution would have led to the development of DNA, as it is more stable than RNA. There were other theories, such as the spontaneous generation of cells, whereby cells were thought to have appeared out of nowhere. However, this was disproved by Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur used an S-shaped flask containing a liquid that had all the nutrients for bacterial growth. Air was allowed to enter the flask via a long tube. The long tube, however, provided an attractive surface for dust in the air carrying bacteria to stick to it. Nothing grew in the liquid unless the flask was tilted, making the liquid touch the contaminated walls of the neck. This showed that the living organisms that grew in such liquids came from outside rather than appearing in the liquid out of nowhere. Another approach could be, instead of self-replicating molecules combine together to form a network. Instead of having these vesicles that divided themselves, the cell membrane could have been a different boundary, like the surface of a rock, for example. Then energy would be required, which could have been obtained from some temperature changes or radioactive substances like uranium. Alternatively, life did not have to start here on Earth. Instead, it could have been delivered to Earth on a comet billions of years ago. These are still suppositions though. The definite answer remains unknown, as experiments have not been able to create life in conditions that were on primitive Earth. Unless you believe in an all-powerful creator and rely on the fact that everything was created as it is. I think it is just amazing though how we, a colony of cells, do not know how we created ourselves. Comment something constructive in order for me to learn and evolve, and hopefully I'll see you later. Okay, so yeah, I'm in a new setup. It's not like that shady garage, but garage I meant, sorry.
I bet you say high school instead of like...
Yeah, it's because I watch so much American TV, but you know, forgive me, English TV is trash.